the thing is that unfortunately we're real late, and I hopefully not too late, because I started stressing this way back in the 1960s in the civil rights movement, that the worst thing you can do is keep depending on your enemy or the people who are totally indifferent to you and who would like to see you being removed. I told them back in 1960, at that time, they were trying to push integration. I told them that, I said, look, and by that time it was almost 98% of all the whites in America were totally opposed to freeing blacks as slaves. Now, almost 100 years later, by the 1960s, in over a 100-year period, the amount of hatred that whites felt for black folk and dependence and the need for black to want to be around black folk or have black folk in a mix with them had decreased only 10% out of 100. It was down to 88%. That means that 88% of the white folk right now, they don't give a damn about black folk. I told blacks and told them that and told them, you keep depending on somebody that has no interest in you, period. And I told them that when in the Constitution, when the Constitution was ratified in 1789, 1 year later, first thing they did was pass an immigration and naturalization law, which says if we're going to be dependent on anybody, we'll bring in a management class and an ownership class into this country. That's why they started bringing in all these poor Europeans into this country. They came over here to be owners of businesses and to be managers in those businesses. They didn't come over here to get jobs for black folk. Nobody is coming to America to get jobs for black folk. They're coming over here to compete with you. And I said, what you got to do as quickly as you can is go back and rebuild your own communities. Rebuild your own communities and build your own businesses. I said, back in the 1950s, that's where you went wrong, when you start pushing social integration and trying to socially integrate black communities. You destroyed black communities. Whites outsmarted you. They took the Eisenhower Act of 1955 and used that to do social integration by coming up with a highway system. They used those highways to drive a highway through every black community in America, and with the intent of destroying them. They didn't drive them through the residential; they drove them through the heart of the black community to make sure they took you out. And now you're dependent on them for food, clothes, everything you need. You got to go to a white business, either in an old black neighborhood, or you got to go to the suburbs. And black folk, you're totally dependent. I told them then. And see, and here we are now, almost exactly where we were at the end of the Civil War. Black folk right now own about 68% of all the black folk in America got some job on the government payroll, particularly the federal level. That's what they're doing on the payroll. 68% sitting up on the government payroll, just like you out on a plantation and picking cotton. Instead of waiting on the master to come out and bring a ham bone or a corn cob for you to suck on to get your nourishment from it, because he ain't gonna feed you. He only allows $15 for a year to feed a black slave. And then and out of that 68% of black folk that are working in some level of government, federal, state, county government, or school teaching, you got about another 23% of the blacks in America are sitting up on the corporate payroll, working for white corporations. They haven't got any black businesses in the country. And so those 68% are working strictly in white businesses, white government, and now the other 23% is working someplace in white corporations, depending on a paycheck from them. You only got 2% of blacks in America working in their own communities, in their own businesses, for their own people. So they put themselves in a position to be wiped out and annihilated. And right now, that's on the schedule. And by the year 2040 or 2045, they plan on wiping black folks off the face of the earth, because of all these other immigrants coming in here. As I told you, that 1890 integration law, nationalization law, they are planning on constantly inputting those people into this country, a continuous inflow to replace you. You're down to nothing now. You're outnumbered 10-1. And you got these sorry Sambos working for the government around them, talking about, we got to have a right to vote. Voting ain't worth a damn. Voting had no power in voting. You outnumbered 10-1, which means every vote you cast, you got your opponents or people against you who hate you and despise you. That 88% of white folks don't want to give you any reparations, anything. They want you to disappear off the face of the earth. And so right now, you didn't follow the things. I said your other option was get you a national black party and organize that, come together and get away from both political parties. The Democrats don't care about you and the Republicans don't care. So Biden don't give a damn about you, just like Obama didn't give a damn about you. And you're still sitting there waiting on them to do something for you. I don't see very much hope. So this is 2021. And in 20 years, when all these immigrants coming in here from Afghanistan and from Asia, they're going to get together just like the Hispanics did. They're going to get together and surpass you. That's why Hispanics surpass you in the year 2000, 20,000. Now where are you now? You're now an underclass, and these Asians and Arabs, they're going to get together and bind and make you not only third-class citizens, they're going to make you fourth-class citizens. You haven't got a snowball's chance in hell unless you go back and start building communities immediately. Get out of both of these parties and start building communities. And I can tell you the kind of industries to go into, what you should be doing, and hire your own people. Quit letting these civil rights organizations saying, we're going to train you for a job. They don't need a job. They need money and wealth. It's too late. If you're going to get them a job, they had full-time employment doing slavery. What they need now is wealth, money. And the Biden administration going to give you anything, they've snowballed you already and used you to get into the office and have us mention the word black out of their mouths in 9 months. And so when this is September, so when November comes, that'll be a year. They haven't done a single thing for black folk, and they're not going to do it for you. I'm sorry.
It's okay. It's okay. I was listening. I know everybody's listening.
I want to keep everybody's attention on this now. On 1516, that the first treaty passed was called the New York Treaty. That was passed in 1516. And it was strictly between Indians and whites, because whites had discovered they wanted to take over all this land in America. So they signed the first treaty with Indians. And that was what they call when they went to 5 civilized tribes. Then that was the biggest tribe, like the Cherokee, Choctaw, and the Mohawks. They signed those treaties, which says that we'll give you clothes, food, weapons, tools, and everything you need, and show you how to become farmers rather than hunters if you just join with us. Because what our intent is to enslave black folk and come up with a labor class that we can all make profits off of. That was in the 1516 with the New York Treaty. That stayed true. So the contrary to these, I say these books all the time about 1620, the first slave. That's a lie. That's saying 1620, that was not when the first slaves came into America. They keep writing these stupid books and people keep buying them. And think about it, that was the first slaves. That 1620 ship that arrived, that did not bring in slaves. Most of those blacks on that ship was not slaves. Those are just blacks being brought in. We did not have slavery in this country until 1637 and 38. And that came through the state of Maryland. And that was called the doctrine of exclusion. The doctrine of exclusion. Because at that point in time, blacks and whites were getting along pretty well. They were all free. There were no slaves at that point in time. But in 1836, at that time, white folk then decided that what we like to do is use these people, since everybody's talking about it, and we let these black folk be, their primary goal be to provide comfort and wealth and power building for whites, period, but never be permitted to enjoy the fruits of white society. That was a doctrine that was put out in about 1836 and 37. And so by 1838, that's when they started. That was the first doctrine that was passed to start talking about enslaving. But the slaving process still was not official until about 3 years later in 1842. In 1842, a black guy who came into this country, a black man came in from England, and he brought a couple of people with him. And when they started talking about enslavement, he says, well, maybe I brought 2 blacks from England with me. He said, I'm going to enslave them. And so and a white guy told him, say, yeah, you can enslave those people. And he enslaved. That was the first person to ever enslave black in America was a black man. He did it against his own people he had brought in from England. And so 1842, that's when slavery was officially announced in this country. Now watch this track now. I got 2 tracks. One track now is for blacks and one is for Indians. Now, Indians were already being approached by whites in 1516 in the New York Treaty and said, we'll give you everything you want, just help us maintain slavery. And so the Indians want to know, what should we do? All I want you to do is to chase them down, bring them back, and help us keep them contained and under control. That's what the Indians got paid for. And say, if we do that, we'll take good care of you. And so what they did, and as a matter of fact, not only will we take care of you, but if you help us maintain slavery, and this was the Choctaw, Chickasaw, Cherokee, and Seminole Indians and Creek Indians, you help us keep these blacks, and we'll pay you $25 for every black that runs away. You bring him back. And if you bring him back, we'll give you $25. If you can't bring him back alive, bring him back dead with his scalp, we'll give you $20. And that's where the Indians start becoming enslaving black folk. The Indians were never friends of black folk. The only ones that came close to being friends of black folk were the Seminoles, because there was no such thing as a Seminole Indian at that time. But see, the Appalachian and the Creek Indians got together with some black slaves, runaway slaves, and they produced a new tribe of Indians called Seminoles down in Florida. That's how the Seminole tribes came about. That Seminole word Seminole meant runaway slave. Now watch what happens. Now, so blacks were enslaved. Blacks were enslaved under the Constitution, the first Constitution, all the way up to 1857. In 1857, that's when the slavery ended officially for black folk. In 1857, because what happened then was a Dred Scott decision that went to the Supreme Court. That Dred Scott decision says that now black folk are not entitled to anything. They're nothing but 3/5 of a human being. They're equal to a field animal. They are indebted and bound by anything. They can't be property owners because they are property. They are property. And then 1857, the Dred Scott decision, that was the end of the first Constitution for whites. That started in 1889, and ran to 1857. Now, at that point, that triggered a thing called the Civil War that came about 2 years later. That Civil War started in the 1860s. And when that started, that was the beginning of a second Constitution. That was a second Constitution. And why did that second Constitution come about? Because there were a few liberal whites called radical Republicans who said that's not right to tell black folk that they are nothing but animals, 3/5 of a human being, and their property, and not entitled to own property. And so they said, as soon as this war is over, we win, we're going to rewrite it. We're going to do something that's totally different, and we're going to call it Reconstruction. Reconstruction, which means we want you to redo what you've been doing in this society against black folk. The reconstruction, that if my car gets wrecked and I take it to the shop, I say, I want you to restructure, repair, redo it. And that's where Reconstruction came in. And Reconstruction came in starting in 1865, which means what you've been doing to black folk was absolutely wrong. And so that's when the second Constitution started in 1865. It started with the 13th Amendment. The 13th Amendment says this, that black folk must be treated in all manners similar to whites, and that white folk cannot misuse them and abuse them anymore. That was the 13th Amendment. And there'll be no more slavery, basically, unless you've been duly convicted of a crime. And that was the 13th Amendment, which means whites cannot do things to black folk they wouldn't be doing to other white folk. And so that was the 13th Amendment. The 14th Amendment came in after that, which says that every level of government must exercise all necessary measures to ensure that they're lifting the burdens and legacies off the shoulders of black folk. And that was strictly and solely for black folk. Why did they say for black folk? Because the Dred Scott decision in 1857 says black people have no rights that white folk are bound to respect. There was nothing in there about handicap, about poor people. There's nothing there about women, gays, transsexuals, midget, one-eyed, one-toed people. It was only not about poor whites. The 13th Amendment was strictly for black folk and to correct the Dred Scott decision. The 13th Amendment, 14th Amendment came in effect to reverse the Dred Scott decision, period. And then the 15th Amendment came in and gave blacks the right to vote, strictly blacks. That's the only group of people that ever got voting rights directly from the government, from the federal government. And that was only black folk. Black folk are exceptional people. They've been treated differently from any people in this nation, maltreated, mistreated. They're not like any other group, and they should never be put into broad categories like minorities and poor folk, people of color, midgets, humpbacks, women, gays, midgets, anything. They are special people. And that gave black folks priority.
Not only do we have current issues to worry about that we're not as concerned about as we should be. But also, you're saying that perhaps to understand the best way to move forward, we got to go back to the past. That we got to go back and deal with the messes and misconceptions of the past. Like, for example, I don't know about everybody else in here, but I was raised to believe Native Americans were always friends to blacks, no matter what. That they went through what we went through, and they're just like us. And now, it kind of shocked me when you were talking about the fact that they were paid to hunt down slaves and cut the scalps off of our grandparents, great grandparents, and they would sell those scalps for money. I mean, that sounds terrible, and I think that that means that we have to relearn our history and then also form new strategies to move forward. So what would be some parting words you'd like to share on that, Dr. Anderson, in terms of how we could take everything that you shared today and start applying some of this individually and as a collective?